Welcome, everybody, to this week's edition of Pluralia Dialogos.
Hang on. Your sound, I heard you said Pluralia Dialogos, and then everything went silent.
Yeah, there was a bit of a technical glitch. I
Oh,
have a
good.
lag.
Not my end
Yeah.
for once. Okay.
No, it's entirely on me. And maybe it's because I'm in France at the moment. I don't know. And the French internet connection might be a little bit off kilter. I don't really know. But point is, welcome, everybody, to this week's edition of Pluralia Dialogos. I am very happy that I'm being joined today by Marty Sieff. I think everybody here watching knows Martin Sieff in some degree or another. He's been a longtime friend and collaborator of both myself, Cynthia, Rising Tide Foundation, and especially Pluralia, a longtime contributor as well, and a close friend with Ed Lazansky, the late Ed Lazansky, who started this initiative. And I'm very happy to have you, Marty, because you always bring to the table historical dynamics and context that is so often lacking to world events. So welcome today. Before I ask you your first question, I just want to say hi. Thanks for coming on, man.
Matt, always a pleasure. You know that.
Well, here we are right now, and there's a lot of bittersweetness. I think we both feel a lot of hope, but also a lot of trepidation about danger points, red alarms that I think we're both picking up on. Our spidey senses tingling, although there are optimistic reasons as well to look to the future. The Middle East being one of the key things I want to talk to you today about and get your thoughts on, but also some elements pertaining to U.S.-Russian relations, some questions I have on Venezuela too. I'd be curious to get your take on some developments there. But starting with the Middle East, this is on everybody's mind because it wasn't that long ago, little over a week ago, that a peace deal was first introduced that could finally settle the genocide in Gaza. And so far, it hasn't been derailed, although it does seem as though there are forces that are intent on sabotaging it. I know that Israel, last time I checked, had something like 47, I forget the exact number, but there was something like 47 different, I have it written down here actually. Hamas has accused Israel of 47 ceasefire breaches and obstructions of humanitarian aid access. The Rafah crossing was bombed earlier today. I think there's something like 38 deaths so far, many more injured. So obviously it's very precarious. But what's your take right now? Are you optimistic about the Israel-Palestine peace deal? What do you see as the good and the bad behind it up until this moment?
I'm very conflicted because, first of all, as you know, you put it very well into words when we were discussing it just a few minutes ago, Matt. I don't want to rain on the parade. The main killing has stopped at long last after 2 hideous years. The Israelis have their surviving hostages back. Hopefully they have closure. The slaughter of the Palestinian people in Gaza has largely stopped. As you point out, it hasn't totally stopped, but it has largely stopped for now. And there's no doubt, thankfully, that President Donald Trump and his chief negotiators, especially Steve Witkoff and the ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, who are usually very partisan on behalf of the Israelis, but have both been working to rein Netanyahu in. An issue that people overlook and are cynical about, but I think has enormous potential significance for the fraying of the US-Israel relationship in the future, and that we need to look into much more closely. So there are positive factors. And for me, the biggest positive factor is what I'd call the Peace of Westphalia principle. In 1648, 30 years of nightmarish slaughter across Europe, mainly in Germany, in the religious wars between Protestants and Catholics finally ended with a peace that satisfied nobody. The compromise of the Peace of Westphalia. The Catholic Habsburg Austrian Empire to the south was frustrated in its efforts to reconquer all of Germany for the one true Catholic faith. And the Protestant Calvinists of the north, Sweden, carrying the shining sword of vengeance through laying waste to Germany, were frustrated in their dreams of destroying Catholic civilization across Europe as well. They had to live with each other, and neither side wanted it. And the hatred did not go away. It took generations to even melt down. And Germany was a bunch of shattered, small, powerless mini states, and it essentially remained that way for the next 200 years. But it worked. It worked. One of the great golden ages of world civilization in literature, in culture, and most of all in philosophy and science, as well as political thought, developed in Germany over the next 200 years as a direct result of the messy peace that nobody wanted or liked or loved at Westphalia. But why did the peace last? Because nobody wanted it to last. The Catholic side didn't want it to last. The Protestant side most certainly didn't want it to last. But they had no choice. They were exhausted. They killed each other off. And that is the main source of hope we see here today. Netanyahu does not want peace. Hamas does not want peace. But they have both been heavily scarred and exhausted by the fighting over the past 2 years. And because there is so much partisanship on both sides, I don't think people can see that overall picture. The haters of Israel, who simply will not be satisfied until Israel, and let's not fool around about this, let's cut to the core. There are two genocidal forces working here. There are dreams among the right-wing ultra-nationalists who have hijacked the Israeli government with Netanyahu's full blessing. They will not be satisfied until Gaza is liquidated, until everybody is either killed or driven out to exile. And I'll tell you straight, they're not going to get it. And on Hamas' side, well, the atrocities of October the 7th, 2023, which none of the supporters or defenders of even the suffering people of Gaza acknowledge, were quite horrific and monstrous, and the Israelis remember this extremely well. And for Hamas, the genocidal extermination of Israel is central. It is in their founding political documents. It is expressed in everything they do. So on both sides, you have implacable, quasi-messianic extremists who would not compromise on anything. So why have they compromised now, even in the short term? Well, first, because President Trump has forced them to. That's central to everything. But the second reason is they're both exhausted. We don't know what the death toll is among the Palestinians. It's at least 45 to 50,000. It could easily be twice or four times that. If you have any figures yourself, I would very much like to see them. All figures from both sides, of course, are hotly contested. I know as a trained historian, disputes about, and you know it too, of course, Matt, disputes about these kinds of casualty figures continue for generations and even centuries afterwards. Did the British Royal Air Force kill 150,000 people in Dresden in 1945? German historians themselves now say the figure is much lower, only 35,000 people, as if that isn't horrific enough. But my own figure is that the German historians are too liberal and are in denial about the scale of the death toll. It was at least 70 to 100,000. In Dresden, may have been higher. But my point is, even after 80 years, it's still being debated. Gaza's death toll will still be debated 80 years from now, but it's there. You shouldn't brush it under the carpet. It'd be monstrous too. It's real. So these figures are real on both sides. But paradoxical, and the Israelis have also lost nearly 1,000 dead. They have lost more dead in the past 2 years in Gaza than they lost fighting the Six-Day War. In proportional American terms, it's the equivalent almost of the US military death toll in Vietnam over 8 or 9 years, which is 57,000. And if you scale up the Israeli population relative to the American population, today, it would be the equivalent of America losing 44,000 men in a year in a war here today.
Yeah.
So both sides have suffered a very great deal, and there is pressure rightly on both sides from Europe and the UN and the world and the Arab world to end the war. And the end of this war is being celebrated, and President Trump is being feted not just by the usual suspects, by the pro-Israel lobby in Washington. All the major leaders of the Arab world and of the wider Muslim world, including Pakistan, are rejoicing in this. And it's very clear why. First, they are rightly humanitarian, and they want the slaughter to end of the Palestinian people in Gaza, period. That's a very real force. But secondly, also, the longer the fighting goes on, and the more that Arab and wider Muslim governments are seen as failing to stop it, that increases the danger of popular revolution in their own countries too, for their own survival. Even pro-Western leaders like President al-Sisi in Egypt and people who are outside that but have their own skin in the game, like President Erdogan in Turkey. It's essential for them and for the leaders of Saudi Arabia. They are, and the UAE, they all recognize for their own national security the crucial importance of ending the slaughter in Gaza and keeping it ended. So all these factors apply. Now, as you rightly say, incidents, killings are continuing.
Yeah.
Now, that's a subject I think we need to tackle very much, and I'd appreciate your assessment on this. I certainly have my own. So, for me, there's a sound of 1.5 hands clapping on this.
Yeah. So similar for me too.
Exactly.
We're both very hopeful, but at the same time, there's one thing that really struck out while I was hearing you speak was that you were citing the Peace of Westphalia as an important historical example that draws some very clear principled parallels to what's going on. And I mean, I was just in Osnabrück and Munster with Cynthia last week, and we went to the city hall where the Peace of Westphalia was signed, at least on the Protestant side, and we got to just be viscerally just appreciate the amount of death and multi-generational killing that had happened. Eye for an eye logic was really taking over, and I think it's hard, again, it's hard to figure out statistics for World War II or even today's Gaza. So, I mean, the exact numbers for how many died during that period is very difficult to discern, but whole villages lost upwards of 50% of their male population. A lot of civilians killed. The economy was in shambles. It was just 30 years of utter havoc and blood. So that was a very important precedent that put an end to that. And as you pointed out, the outcome of that shift in thinking resulted in a massive boon of scientific, economic development. The foundations of the modern sovereign nation state, as we know, was really enshrined at that period in 1648. And the parallels are very similar. When nobody would have thought that it were possible in 1647 or 1646 to put an end to that, but it did happen. Today, however, Tony Blair is somebody who introduced in his Chicago speech in 1999 something known as the Blair Doctrine, just a couple of years before 9/11. And within that very infamous speech, he first laid out something that Henry Kissinger also made a theme of many of his planning and his speeches, which was the idea of the post-Westphalian era. And I've got a quote from one of his speeches where he said, a little after 9/11, he said, "Before September 11th, I was already reaching for a different philosophy in international relations from the traditional one that has held sway since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, namely that a country's internal affairs are for it, and you don't interfere unless it threatens you, or breaches a treaty, or triggers an obligation of alliance." So Blair made a big purpose of his life, or it was assigned to him, to advance a post-Westphalian era, meaning a post-nation-state era where supranational enforcement could lord over the elected representation of governments around the world. And now all of a sudden we find that Blair, this is a part of the bitter part of the sweetness, is that Blair has been named as one of the key figures who will be apparently presiding over this interim government. I think it's called the Gaza International Transition Authority, which is supposed to govern for 7 years, according to certain arrangements. And the figure of Tony Blair has been announced as a key figure who will be overseeing this. Do you know what does that make you feel? What are your concerns? Do you think that this is maybe just a nominal thing, or do you think that there's maybe something more dangerous about having Blair and the post-Westphalian ideology involved in this transitional government?
I'm old. I have many aches and pains commensurate with my age, but so far I have been spared psoriasis. And yet whenever Tony Blair's name comes up, I want to scratch my body all over. I feel as if I have got psoriasis whenever Tony Blair is in the immediate vicinity, Matt. It makes my flesh literally creep. This guy justified and was a driving force behind the annihilation of Libya, the annihilation of Syria, which were by no means idyllic states, though Libya was prosperous and peaceful and safe, which it most certainly is not now. Its people are enslaved. It is a major source of Islamist fundamentalism, of drug trafficking, and worst of all, of human trafficking for the world. It has become a nightmare. 600,000 people at least were killed in what was fraudulently labeled as a crusade to free the Syrian people. Instead, it destroyed them. And Blair, of course, is also very much involved in pushing the Ukrainian people to get themselves slaughtered. 1.7 million so far, mainly under the presidency of Joe Biden. And of course, in a way, you can't blame Biden, because Biden did not exist, does not exist, is a non-entity. It was the people who were pushing it, who nobody holds to account, former Secretary of State Antony Blinken and former National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. Classic examples of apparent non-entities, but so was Heinrich Himmler, who inflict unbelievable suffering and needless suffering to a nightmarish degree on the world, while remaining apparently colorless non-entities. And Blair's bat wings are fluttering in the background of all this. You made a very interesting point before, and that is the association of Henry Kissinger and Tony Blair. I think Blair is aspiring to rise to the dark throne of manipulating behind the scenes, that it was at least ascribed to Mr. Kissinger, and was certainly very actively involved with by his friend and rival and often political opponent. But of course, they were both kind of flip sides of the same coin, Zbigniew Brzezinski. And I was privileged to cover them both over decades and even to meet them socially, both of them, on many occasions. And they're both fascinating individuals, though that is not meant to, say that I revered unconditionally both of them, to put it mildly. I did not. I mean, it's like, can you, even if a Tyrannosaurus Rex is not actually eating you, but you find yourself standing beside him, should you admire the dinosaur or should you run for your life? You know, there is that sense of being beside casual power that will casually blot out anything that's in its path, often without even thinking about it. Mr. Blair is now being groomed to hold that kind of role as the great wise statesman in the world. And that is hideously bad news and frightening news for the human race. Can I put into specify in detail what he is going to do in Gaza, what will follow in Gaza? Of course I can't. But on his past track record, it's very creepy. And it's like betting on horses. What do you bet on? You bet on, or if you follow the NFL, like I do. Baseball is different. Baseball is inherently unpredictable. But there is an element in the National Football League in America of predictability. The Kansas City were the best team in the world for 5 years. Now, most certainly, they are not. This is clear. How do we know this? The way people play last week and the week before that. Tony Blair's track record is terrifying. It is what is this new post-Westphalian world? It is actually the old British and French Anglo-imperial 19th century world revived. And actually, eventually, they would look to shove America off the scene as well. It is neo-imperialism on the grand scale, presenting itself as a world without borders. We have Médecins Sans Frontières. We are going to have imperialism sans frontières. That's really what Tony Blair is all about. And what we are looking at Gaza is truly hideous. The mess in Gaza ultimately goes back, as virtually every major mess in the world does, to the British Empire and to the way the British miscalculated as usual and skedaddled, but left a hideous mess behind them in Palestine. with both the Jews and the Palestinians fighting as they felt for their existential lives against each other in 1947 and 1948. And it was the British who messed that up in the first place. And Gaza was at the heart of that. The British occupied Gaza from 1917 to 1947. 30 years of British misrule and hypocrisy and manipulation and bungling created a situation that has steadily deteriorated for the almost 80 years since then.
Yeah.
And now the British will be coming back. Gaza, if it is presented plausibly to the world, and it will be presented plausibly to the world, as this, no doubt, the trade in human trafficking will continue, terrorism will continue, even if Netanyahu is restrained from launching his legions and his bombs against the long-suffering people of Gaza. What will we see? We will see failure disguised as success. Failure disguised as success. The greatest of all modern comic book creators, Jack Kirby, the genius who gave us Doctor Doom, the X-Men, Darkseid, the New Gods, the Hulk himself, true contributions to world literature and culture on this scale. And you know me well enough to know I am not joking, at least for myself. But Jack Kirby also created in his Forever People comic the concept of how he saw Disney World and Disneyland. He called it Happy Land. It was a concentration camp where people are repeatedly enslaved, terrorized, slaughtered. And the whole purpose is to make them scream, to create psychic energy. And this is presented and transmuted to the wider world as if they are laughing and having a wonderful time. And this is what Gaza is going to be turned into if Tony Blair succeeds. It is going to be turned into Happy Land. It is going to be turned into a concentration camp and a cynical entrepôt port for international terrorism and the subversion of governments around the Middle East and around the world, and the extension of neo-imperial British influence on a grand scale, presented as peace and happiness in our time. It is Jack Kirby's vision of Happy Land. Cynicism, gangsterism, and sin and evil presented as virtue. Presented to the world as virtue, and most people will be dumb enough, unless, of course, they watch our podcast and those of our friends, to believe it.
Yeah, you brought up a lot here, and I think actually, what was the name? Just that the inner comic book geek inside of me is just coming out a little bit now. What is this Forever People comic book?
The Forever People, which was published from 1970 for only a couple of years afterwards. It was too strong stuff for DC Comics, although it sold quite well and made a profit. They immediately pulled the plug on it. Okay. A similar fate occurred to the wonderful television series Nautilus about Captain Nemo, because it was too obviously anti-British imperial.
Right.
But that's worth chasing up to. But you can chase up the Forever People either online, you'll find everything online these days, or in the Jack Kirby Omnibus, Kirby Omnibus volume from DC Comics.
All right, that was a surprising little fact I didn't expect to discover in the course of our show today. So that's always something I should come to expect with you. All right, so one thing that I've heard a number of commentators refer to when describing the current Gaza plan, and also Tony Blair's way of thinking about this, is the two precedents that are informing, or I'm told, I don't know to what degree, we're not privy to these back channel conversations. A lot of this is not written down. But I've heard a number of high-level commentators making the reference to the precedents of Kosovo as successful precedents, and of Lebanon under the French mandate, which I think was enshrined in 1943 when you had a certain pact in Lebanon, the National Pact. So the first thing, the French, under the control of their part of the mandate, the British did their little carving up and set up different tribal factions against each other, as they always do. The French were using a similar technique on their part of the jurisdiction, and that resulted directly in, as far as the Lebanon situation is concerned, it resulted directly in the very foreseeable civil war that went on for a couple of decades at least, until 1989, from 75 to 89. it was a massacre in Lebanon, but very, very foreseeable because that's how it was orchestrated from those who created this peace plan to begin with. In the case of Kosovo, they often sell it as being like the greatest thing. We stopped the genocidalist Slobodan Milosevic from killing his people, and what a great thing we did by creating responsibility to protect and creating a UN administration above nation states. Well, I think Blair was playing a role in that. What is the reality behind those two? I mean, what was really happening in 1999? Was it as much of a success as I'm being told it was, or was there a darker, uglier side of the picture that you've looked at?
I'm not an expert on it. I have friends who are in of my generation. All too many of them are gone now, unfortunately. Wonderful reporters like Claude Solhani, my lifelong close friend, with whom basically Claude and I ran UPI. I can't say single-handed, we were doing it together, but we basically kept it afloat for a decade together, and then we knocked around Central Asia, pioneering major coverage in English and French and Arabic of the Caspian Basin energy cornucopia 15 years ago. But Claude is gone now, deeply alas. The great Robert Fisk, the great British correspondent who covered the hideous mess in Lebanon. These are the people who saw the reality of what was going on. There is a line somewhere, I think a Greek dissident used it about the Roman Empire after the Romans conquered Greece and crushed there in the 2nd century before Christ. And the Romans acclaimed it, rather like Tony Blair acclaiming the achievements of Kosovo and Lebanon. They create a wilderness and call it peace. But the label is important, because I bring in here again, I think, the greatest of all modern surrealistic science fiction writers, the man who really takes Kafka to a degree that Kafka himself never took it. The late, incredibly prolific Philip K. Dick, the man who wrote The Man in the High Castle, and no less than 70 other novels which are equally brilliant and extraordinary as well. And in another of his books, I think it's Time Out of Joint, Philip K. Dick creates a post-nuclear world where everything is a smoldering room, but not to worry, because people in that world have been brainwashed. And all they have to do is pass some smoldering remains, and it says McDonald's burger restaurant, and they imagine there really is a McDonald's there full of juicy burgers, and they go into it every day and they have their burger and then they walk home. But it isn't there, it's just a piece of paper, pasted on the wall, and their home doesn't exist. They live in a tent. They don't have a bathroom. They have to pee in the backyard, in the radioactive waste in the backyard. But there is a little piece of paper in what ought to be the front garden saying semi-detached home with garden, running water, and central heating. Just a piece of paper. And as long as that piece of paper is there, they believe they really are living in a nice semi-detached middle-class home. And that's what the world we have now moved into. Through the media, we are presented with fictional images of Kosovo, of Libya, of Syria, liberated, freed, free market, peace and prosperity, happiness for all, la-di-da. Now Venezuela for its oil, and Gaza as a stepping stone for neo-imperialism in the Middle East are being set up for the same treatment. The people will suffer. They will be occasionally bombed into submission by the Israelis. There will be terrorist attacks from Hamas. Hamas has taken over Gaza, and Hamas itself now is executing the people who protested to celebrate the end of the war only a couple of weeks ago. We have a surrealistic nightmare situation in Gaza. As if the Israelis were not bad enough, Hamas is back slaughtering its own people. But this will be presented as another Tony Blair triumph. And President Trump ought not to be too hopeful about getting a Nobel Peace Prize. It will obviously go to Tony Blair. I mean, they gave it to Kissinger for ending the war in Vietnam when he didn't end the war in Vietnam. They gave it to Yasser Arafat when he was still apart from anything else, Arafat's role in what you have just talked about in the destabilization of Lebanon and the creation of a monstrous civil war, again, in which hundreds of thousands of people were killed, is never discussed. But of course, that war was a direct result of what you rightly said, Matt, because the Muslim populations, at least many of the Muslim populations in southern Lebanon, especially the Shiite people, were downgraded and treated like dirt and enslaved. But this is an old story. Yeah. I've recently been researching the true story of the Anglo-American French, especially Anglo-American settlement of Central Europe after World War I. And it was a chaos and it was a shame. And it replaced the genuinely increasingly prosperous and tolerant Austro-Hungarian Empire with a series of racist little vicious mini-states. The Czechs enslaved the Slovak people to a degree that even white racists enslaving black slaves in the American antebellum South would have been ashamed of. The Romanians invaded Hungary and raped thousands of women in Budapest within 2 years of the end of World War I. This is never mentioned in liberal Western histories of the triumph of Versailles. Yeah. But they happened. The Greeks tried to enslave Turkey and enslave the Turkish people. It did not work out well for them. It was a catastrophe for the Greek people. All of these were consequences of the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 and the Treaty of Versailles and what followed it. But the whole world believed this because they were told to believe it. It was the Philip K. Dick vision again. You take a little piece of paper and you say, peace in our time. There's the peace. Everybody says, yay. Now, that's my fear here, that this is what Gaza's fate is going to be. And maybe that of the wider Palestinian people and of the Israeli people too. Yep. Heaven knows what they're going to be victims of. And it's not just malevolence they're going to be victims of, and greed. They're going to be victims of incompetence. Yeah. Because one last point, I think if you put Tony Blair under a lie detector machine, a polygraph, and asked him, do you want peace and prosperity? Are you confident he would get it? He would answer in the affirmative and pass any polygraph test with flying colors because he believes his own lies.
Yeah. Well, if you don't believe in truth, then it's easy to pass a polygraph test, right? If the world is just a big joke, right? Yeah. And he certainly is not he's definitely of the psychological type that believes that truth is whoever has the power to make the definitions and impose their definition of truth. So yeah, that makes sense. Now, something that's been concerning me as well is that we know that people like Ben-Gvir are, foaming at the mouth, even already calling for a reactivation of the war.
Of course,
in Gaza, so quickly. I mean, Netanyahu is giving a different messaging. Of course, he's not saying that. He's still acting as if he's pleased. However, it does seem to me that Ben-Gvir is at least more honest. He's more transparent in his sociopathy than a Netanyahu who's a little bit more subtle and layered, who can hide their motives better. But he's been a longtime proponent, as is Netanyahu, of Greater Israel, which doesn't seem to be simply a geopolitical ambition. It really does seem to be something that's tied to almost a religious ambition to extend the borders of current Israel far beyond their current demarcations to encapsulate. I think it's like a third of all of Jordan and some of Egypt to the Sinai, like all the Sinai Peninsula, some of Saudi Arabia, most of Syria, all of Lebanon would be involved in that expansion of this idea of Greater Israel. And so it seems like this Gaza plan does provide it puts a wrench in the machine of the Greater Israel fanatics, but they're still there. They still have carried out their, practice run sacrifice of the red heifer to prepare for the building of Solomon's third temple. That happened. They did the practice run. They killed the cow. They've got 3 more cows that are supposedly all red, ready to go. So how genuine do you think Israel is? Do you think that possibly the Greater Israel agenda has been put aside and it might not be as much of a danger as we thought it was a week or two ago? Or do you think that it's still a danger as much as it was a month, 2 months, ago.
Israel is a deeply divided country,
Mm.
and it has historically, within limits, of course, but it has also been for its Israeli and to some degree, at least, for its own Israeli citizenship Muslim population, a democratic country. There have been critics of Israeli government policies openly elected by the Arab communities, who've in the Knesset, they've often been howled endlessly at by the majority, but they stood their ground and they were allowed to speak as well. But all opinion polls indicate that Israel is very much divided between the religious and nationalist right, which itself has many divisions in it, and the small L liberal left, and I don't use liberal in a pejorative sense here, far from it, I use it in a very positive sense. I would say social democratic, rational elements in Israel. And there has always been this tension in Israel, however ruthless and mean previous Likud national prime ministers like Ariel Sharon, Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir were. They all lived in the real world. Ehud Olmert certainly did. And they would go and try and get what they could get to maximize the power of the country. They were all in favor of greater Israel if they thought they could get away with it. But they were not irrational in the widest sense. They were like Bismarck when he was leader of Prussia. I want a united Germany. I want Prussia to expand to be the dominant power in Europe, which seemed an insane possibility in the 1840s and early 1850s when Otto first came on the scene. But you take advantage of opportunities when they come your way. And if you're lucky and brilliant, both, it's amazing how far you can go. That was their attitude. And I thought for a long time this was Mr. Netanyahu's attitude as well. But now he's in with Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who he's dependent on for his coalition to survive, are messianists. They are religious lunatics. Mm-hmm. And the question the whole world now faces is, beneath his moderate, apparently rational, however nationalist and however uncompromising veneer, is Mr. Netanyahu the same? Is he just going along with him to stay in power because he will face endless investigations on his alleged personal corruption, and much more dangerously now on his political incompetence and military incompetence in allowing the Hamas attack, which slaughtered 1,400 Israelis 2 years ago, to be investigated? That has never been investigated in Israel. And Netanyahu and the Likud and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who were in the government with him at the time, left secular Western Israel facing Gaza defenseless against the possibility of any attack from Hamas. And the conspiracy theorists say they actually wanted the liberal secular Israelis to be slaughtered. Perfectly feasible, but I think it is much more likely that they were simply arrogant and stupid, that they thought Netanyahu thought he had tamed Hamas. He had tamed the savage beast, the savage dog. He had them eating out of his hand. Mm-hmm. He was piss ignorant, of course. He got it completely wrong. The biggest problem with Mr. Netanyahu, like with so many people like him, is not their brutality and their evil. It is their incompetence. It is their criminal stupidity in not recognizing what they are unleashing on the world. And that's the biggest danger, of course, we face in trying to avoid a thermonuclear confrontation with Russia over the still continuing conflict in Ukraine. If we don't bring that to an end, there's very ominous talk coming out of Moscow. Putin is perfectly capable of pressing the button, but he is not even the main extremist in Russia. He is a relative liberal and moderate and peacemaker relative to so many of his own people around him, both in the government and in Russian public opinion. This is never acknowledged in the Western press. We need to defuse the sense of desperation that a thermonuclear superpower that can annihilate us in minutes, that its people and the policymakers increasingly have in Moscow. But it's the same. Our people in dealing with Ukraine and Russia have the same problem that we see in Netanyahu and now Blair in dealing with Gaza. The worst thing is not their malevolence, which I do not mean to deny. It is their criminal incompetence.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. And we're dealing. It's very difficult these days, and maybe it's always been difficult to sort of zero in on what's the game plan, what's the method, because there's so many layers and games within games. One of the noteworthy developments that have happened, I think it was just a couple of days ago, Putin delivered a message to his Iranian counterparts, the Iranian foreign minister, on behalf of Israel, saying that Israel wants a peaceful resolution to their conflict, their issues with Iran. I'm wondering now if Putin is being deceived, if Israel is trying to deceive perhaps Iran. I know that it wasn't that long ago that we had the short-lived 12-day war where much of the Iranian leadership was decapitated. Many of the nuclear scientists were killed. Many of the leading generals with a lot of experience were murdered in that period. So it was a big decapitation of qualified leadership in Iran. Many of those people, especially in the scientific community, were involved with negotiations with their American counterparts on coming up with some workable nuclear deal. So they were killed. I mean, you basically killed a bunch of people on the negotiating time. We also had the case where Israel not that long ago attacked Doha, killing many of the Hamas negotiators who were involved with trying to come up with some peace proposal. This is well over a month ago now, but still, we know that I think that was September 9th of this year. But we know that strategic deception is part of the game. So I'm wondering here, do you think that the ambition to attack Iran, which we know, I mean, even Blair and the Richard Pearl, PNAC networks, the Project for New American Century neocon networks, who were like preparing the groundwork for 9/11 26 years ago, 27 years ago, were already talking about Iran as the ultimate trophy to be overthrown. So is that something which you think is still in play as an operation right now?
Well, for people like that, it's always there is an aspiration. And more as an aspiration. And they think they've got President Trump in their pocket, which I'm not so sure. Trump is strongly biased in favor of Israel. And that skews his view towards the entirety of the Middle East to a very negative degree. But at the same time, there are contradictions in President Trump's point of view. And we see this in his policies towards Ukraine too. He genuinely wants peace, but he surrounds himself with people who want war. And he doesn't appear to be even aware personally of the contradiction in his position. There are lots of conflicts there. To understand President Trump's view of the world and his grand strategy, you have to go back to basics, which is President Trump gets all his ideas on geopolitics, God help us, from Fox News. Now, that doesn't make him a warmonger or a figure of evil. But it explains the paradox that you have a man who genuinely wants peace, genuinely wants to end the war and the killing in Ukraine, who is genuinely humane, but at the same time keeps appointing people and listening to people around him who are actually out to do the opposite of what he wants to do. There is inherent contradiction here. You'll remember the exact terms, Matt, I forget them, but the Marxists have some terms, the dialectic process, inherent conflicts that you have to analyze, not just on your own side, but on the opponent's side as well. And as I get older, increasingly admire and respect the philosophies of Arnold Toynbee and most of all of George Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel. And Hegel talks about how if you have any force in the world, there will always be counter forces coming up to oppose it. And as you have often pointed out yourself and your brilliant wife, Cynthia, it's always a false dichotomy to say something has to be either capitalism or communism. Very often, the wise, humane way ahead is something totally different from both of them. Or as we found after Westphalia, a grudging coexistence between different forces. I think President Putin may have this in mind. I don't think he falls for anything from either Tehran or Tel Aviv. But he recognizes, especially from Russia's perspective, the dangers that a full-out polarizing war between Iran, which he has treaty alliances to, because Iran is a full member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization with India, China, and Russia. So there are strong security guarantees and commitments on behalf of Russia and China to preserve and protect Iran, which nobody ever talks about.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, President Putin has always had excellent relations with Israel and even with Mr. Netanyahu personally. And most of all, he does have personally good relations with President Trump, which I think is why he finds President Trump's zigzags and wobbles on Ukraine so frustrating and even at times so puzzling, though I'm sure they have them very competently analyzed in Moscow. I wish we were as competent in analyzing them as they are in analyzing us. But there are all these factors coming into play. So I think Mr. Putin is not being manipulated by anyone, is not being fooled by anyone, but he is genuinely doing what he can to try and keep the Israelis and the Iranians from both being gung-ho in wiping out, trying to wipe out each other and pulling the whole world into it. Mm-hmm. And that's a very real danger. And you do have this millennialist regime, which is looking to the coming of the 12th Mahdi still, has never given up its own messianist obsessions in Tehran. And now in Israel, although you have still a largely secular, rational society, it is in the hands of people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, and for that matter, Netanyahu, who show every sign, as you say, of following the beat of an irrational, wild, mad fantasy drummer. I recently published an article in Realist Review in Washington in which I warned of the danger that Mr. Netanyahu might be falling into what I called the Venizelos error. Eleftherios, well, there's a name for you, Eleftherios Venizelos was the repeatedly elected, hugely popular, and still is as a mythical figure today in Greece, who was a great champion of creating a greater Greece at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. And he got the approval of the superpowers of his day, Britain and France. Not the United States, but he got the approval of Britain and France to invade Turkey, to bring the blessings of European Christian civilization to the Turkish Muslim people when they did not want it. A very unwise thing to do. There were 7 million people in Greece. They had no significant military tradition. They were filled with weapons. Does this start to sound familiar from Britain and France? Which they were not even trained to use and could not use. They were up against a militarily stripped but militarily hugely experienced and formidable Turkish population, more than 2.5 times their size in Turkey. They overextended. Venizelos got kicked out of office. It would have been probably even worse if he stayed in. Instead of creating a new classical Greek empire to recreate the glories of 3,000 years ago, which is what Venizelos had taught, and everybody thought it was a lovely idea. So beautiful. Winston Churchill loved the idea at the time. David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Britain, fell totally in love with the idea at the time. You know, we're going to rebuild the Parthenon again on a far bigger scale. What's not to love about that? Mm-hmm. But it was another Philip K. Dick piece of paper plastered up on an empty, smoldering ruin. It was a fantasy. Right. It was brainwashed hogwash. The end result was the annihilation of the Greek Christian communities in Asia Minor, in modern Turkey, which had survived there, usually in peace, not always, but usually in peace and security, under the Ottoman Empire for 500 years. And in the Turkish nationalist reaction, they were driven into the sea and annihilated. One of the improbable eyewitnesses of this was Ernest Hemingway. Though, of course, he simply wrote a couple of pages of purple-sounding prose and then ran for his life, which is what Hemingway always did in reality. I'm not a Hemingway fan. I put him down with Tolstoy, among the infernal Pied Pipers of our time. But Venizelos created the opposite of what he wanted to create. Instead of creating a new Greek empire, he annihilated 3,000 years of Greek civilized life and society on the mainland of Asia Minor and Asia. And that's what Mr. Netanyahu is risking doing now. Like Venizelos, he is in faith, he is chasing a dream, a fantasy, bullshit, hot air, a fart, something that smells sweet to yourself and stinks to everybody else.
You're a poet, Marty.
An Irish poet.
Yeah, right.
In the Irish tradition, Matt.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the art of the dirty limerick, I'm sure, is something you also can wield pretty well. All right, so let me. Somebody watching live right now, Warren Cannell, a good friend of mine, he made the point that the Peace of Westphalia moment actually occurred at the 35-minute mark of the Zelensky-Trump press conference when, from out of the blue, a question was proposed of Putin-Trump Bering Strait tunnel. And that's something that caught my eye too, because I find hovering over this conversation about what's missing from the peace plan in the Middle East is this idea of concrete goals that will uplift the quality of life of our children in the future. And that was what was sort of, I think, the secret sauce to the success of the Peace of Westphalia, was that you had Colbert, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the great finance minister of France, who was able to step in with this bold idea that neither side within the German warring factions were able to sort of like organize on their own, but they needed a little bit of help from somebody who knew how this stuff, who would overcome a lot of these internal civil war problems. In this case, France had their own 30 Years' War in the end of the 16th century, and they overcame it under Henry of Navarre. But Colbert was sort of bringing out an idea of economic large-scale development, of facilitating government credit towards building canals. There were hundreds of small and medium water projects, roads, schools. So that type of stimulus gave, I think, the means by which people could believe that peace and forgiveness with your enemy were possible. And what Monty was hitting at today is something that I haven't seen really in a very long time. In my whole lifetime, I've never seen this type of thinking in Western politics, but it's coming out, it seems, with this proposition that Trump literally said he's interested in this Russian idea or offer that's been on the table now for like 15 years for extending rail lines through the Bering Strait connecting Russia to Alaska. And I think that there's even some file inside of the JFK files that were given from the Russians to some American congresswomen or men and women, which the Russians had tried to give decades ago. The American side didn't want to hear what the JFK files were, but now it's come back again, and some of these documents have been made public. And one of them was an American civil engineer, a Chinese American civil engineer in the 1960s, who called this thing I actually have an image of it that I pulled up while you were speaking here. I'm just going to show it on the screen. Here it is. Here's the Kennedy-Khrushchev World Peace Bridge. And there's that drawing right on the screen from the JFK files featuring the rail line connecting Russia to Alaska and down into Canada and the broader continent. Apparently, this was something that both John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev were looking at. Apparently, I'd like to know more about the details there, but it's certainly a long time coming. There's been discussions of this in the 19th century. I know that there's been a couple of czars, Alexander II, III, Nicholas II, who were looking very, very favorably at this. So was Lincoln. And I know there's been modern statesmen like Lyndon LaRouche today who's been promoting this thing. The Russians have been very, very adamant of bringing this back since 2007 when Putin started. So do you think that Trump is genuine, and how do you think this would change world dynamics if the U.S. and Russians were to agree on such a project? What would need to change in the world to allow something like Arctic collaboration of that magnitude? What would need to change for that to happen?
Oh, first of all, let's take the last point first, because you started our podcast with this very point. Who are the enemies of peace and coexistence and growing prosperity? You need to take Brussels and Paris and most of all the city of London out of the equation. You'd have to take the enemies of coexistence out of the equation. They are the enemies. As to President Trump, we see here now in America an increasing effort to turn President Trump into what Joe Biden was, but was never admitted to be. Joe Biden, as I said, was a turd. He had no brain. A turd has no brains. Here is the Irish genius for limerick obscenity, central to the reality. Bismarck thought this way. It worked for him. Bismarck was right. We have We had a president of the United States who was not president of the United States. He was a turd. He was a stinking little obscenity who was capable of nothing and happily provided, so far as he was conscious of it, of the needless sending of 1.5 million Ukrainian boys to their slaughter, and the endless slaughter of the Gazan people as well, in a war that Israel could easily have been reined in on and was contrary to the Israelis' own interests. That little psychopath didn't care, didn't have the brains to, but the policy was done for him by the creepy people around him. Today we have the opposite. We have a president of the United States who is there. He's an old man. He's 78 going on 79. But there is an effort in Europe and in America itself, in the mainstream so-called media, to delegitimize President Trump yet again. This time they are trying to do it by saying, oh, he's senile, he has health problems. Well, who wouldn't have health problems at 78? Everybody has health problems at any time, but especially when you're in your 8th decade. Well, duh. But he's very much still there. And you just pointed it out again, Matt. This is a hard, serious idea that the president keeps coming back to. And the president was a businessman. He built Trump Tower. He built casinos. He built hotels. He built resorts. He's a Queen's developer, which is all we used to sneer at him by the assholes who are just useless and could not, build a latrine. They could not build a latrine. The president builds resorts. He thinks in concrete construction terms. And therefore, he is sincere about this. He is serious about this. He is committed to this. And I think and hope Vice President Vance, if he becomes the anointed successor to the president in the next term, will think similarly in these terms too. I think there's a very likely and hopeful possibility of this. And this is exactly what you need. And this does not guarantee peace. The level of economic cooperation between Britain and Germany up to 1914 was gigantic, growing, unprecedented. And that did not stop the forces of irrationality and hatred and sheer stupidity in both Berlin and London from sweeping it all away in the catastrophe of 1914 and thereafter, when Britain actually came into the war to defend a tiny country, Belgium, which was actually the largest genocidal nation in the world. They had killed 10 million black people, 10 million African people in the Congo just for slavery and to make profit from it in the 25 years from 1883 to 1908, until the great Irish humanitarian statesman and his colleagues and friends, Roger Casement and his colleagues, exposed it all and used international opinion to force an end to it. But it was on behalf of this regime that an entire young generation of British, Canadian and Australian and New Zealand and South African soldiers and Indian soldiers were all sent to their deaths needlessly in World War I. Britain need never have been involved and should not have been. And this was despite the fact that Britain and Germany were close allies. But you have made another point, and I think it's a brilliant insight, never occurred to me before. I've never heard anyone make it before you and Monty. And that is the role of Jean-Baptiste Colbert. In America, everybody is totally ignorant of Colbert and what he did and what he achieved. They worship a liberal, cheap little comedian who loves to sneer at President Trump and is incapable of an any courageous independent thought of his own, Stephen Colbert. Well, big deal. Let's flush Stephen Colbert down the latrine where he rightly belongs, with all the rest of the stinking filth and absurdity. Let's elevate and go back to Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who was the great architect in modern national state economics of generating, as you said, peace as well as prosperity. Now, I had never thought of, I was a great admirer of Colbert for many years because of his achievements in France and as a template for development of Western nations. But I never before myself thought of the constructive role he played in rebuilding Germany after the first Great War, the 30 Years' War. But this is not unprecedented. We've seen it right before my own lifetime. There is a modern Colbert, and he was American. George Marshall, General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army through World War II, and then Secretary of State of the United States under President Truman, and winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. And what was he given the Peace Prize for? His role in rebuilding Western Europe which central to which was the Marshall Aid Plan, the European Recovery Program of the late 1940s, when the United States, in its own interest, rightly so, pump primed the European economies, Germany, Italy, France. They offered it to Eastern Europe too, but Stalin said no. And most of all, Britain. Britain was the biggest beneficiary of Marshall Aid, though unlike France and Italy and Germany, they wasted it typically on City of London schemes rather than rebuilding their own basic industry. This is very important and is not understood because the Labour government, advised by John Maynard Keynes after 1945, were illiterates, were economic illiterates. But Marshall is the modern Colbert, and Trump wants to be his successor. There was a Colbert I in the 17th century, 350 years ago. There was a Colbert II, who rebuilt Germany and the rest of Europe, including Britain, again after World War II, and that was General George Marshall. President Trump wants to be the 21st century's Colbert III, rebuilding the Middle East. This is a noble and admirable and realistic policy if it is pursued realistically. And President al-Sisi recognizes this in Egypt, and I think President Erdogan does in Turkey too, and certainly the leaders in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan are ready to be constructive on this. And there are many leaders in Israel who would do so as well if they were given the chance. If Netanyahu and most of all Smotrich and Ben-Gvir were not politically in the way. Israel needs not war, not assassination, God forbid, but it needs to revive its democratic political values and turf out the useless incompetence who led it into the catastrophe it is still in now, because Israel will be destroyed if these people stay in power. Their policies make that inevitable. They have an Isolos again. Incidentally, a couple of weeks ago, I was visiting my favorite Greek diner. I won't name it in case some lunatic goes after it for retaliatory action, but it's about a 30-mile drive from us here in New Jersey. And I noticed something that I hadn't noticed before. You can buy, among the brands of excellent Greek coffee that you can buy there, they have one labeled Venizelos coffee. Venizelos. It's like Winston Churchill. Or it's like Andrew Jackson. These people, war criminals and catastrophic losers who destroy their countries or create suffering on an unprecedented scale, become transmuted into folklore. It's a Philip K. Dick moment. You simply hang the label genius on them, a visionary, and all the killing and slaughter, not just of Turkish people on the other side, but of their own Greek people too. Maybe, God help us, if Israel survives, there's going to be a Netanyahu coffee or a Netanyahu hummus 200 years from now. I hope not, but who knows? I mean, Winston Churchill in his own lifetime was loathed by most of the British people. He never got a majority of the British people to vote for him in a popular election. Even when he won an election, it was simply because of the way the electoral process, put his party in charge. But even then, far more people voted for the Labour Party in 1951 than did for Churchill. All his life, Churchill never once got the British people, a majority of them, to vote for him. Hitler never once got a majority of the German people to vote for him. Not once. Too many of them were too civilized and too sensible. But once he got into power through political machinations, forget about the democracy, forget about fair play.
Well, that at that point, that was enabling acts ruled by emergency decree, and that's the game of all tyrants, which is why they love false flags. That's why they love to create chaos, because people can remain in terror in days of lead and give up their liberty for a bit of security, which Ben Franklin said, if you do that, you don't deserve either. So hopefully we are at a place where we can learn from these historical examples. And, history is so littered with smacks across the head of things we shouldn't be doing that we see too many of our fellow citizens doing stupidly. So hopefully now is the time, when the stakes are as high as they are, that we can people can listen to the words and the thoughtfulness and read the books like Cycles of Change, produced by Marty Sieff, and really, really not fall for these same traps that idiots have fallen for so many times to the expense of humanity as a whole. So Marty, we've reached the top of the hour. I thank you so much for taking the time today to go through a lot of this very important geopolitics and share your wisdom. And for everybody listening, 2 weeks from now, we're going to do this yet again for Pluralia Dialogos. Take care and have a great day.
Thank you. Always a pleasure and a privilege, Matt. Thank you.